Thank you. I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to what's been a very stimulating couple of days. I've learned a huge amount. I'm aware of my obligations as the last speaker, not just of today, but of 3 years' worth of conferences in this respect. I'm sure I'm not going to live up to people's expectations, except I will try only to talk for 10 minutes. So, I wrote a book called The End Times of Human Rights. That's why I was invited here. So I should say something about why I think we live in an era where we approach the end times of human rights, and that's what I'm going to try to do. I, in contrast to some of the more optimistic narratives, think that, in fact, we approach an era where human rights are less, not more, effective than they have been for a long time. As a shorthand for this, I'll use the idea of the decline of the West. Within the book that I wrote, I try to argue that we've been on a 150, 200-year upswing in terms of the influence and, if you like, the metaphysical confidence of the West. But in the last 30, 40, 50 years, certainly post the Second World War, underneath the building of a more and more elaborate superstructure of law and institutions, there's been a kind of epistemic and moral crisis. In the contemporary era, that's accompanied by a diminution in the power of Western states, particularly in the power of European states to influence the international system. I'll be interested in questions about the ambiguous position of the United States in relation to the West, particularly as it turns its gaze, if the Ukraine and Middle East will allow it, to the Asia-Pacific. But the rise of an Asia-Pacific century clearly poses a particular set of difficult questions for the Western idea. These are societies which have a long history. In 1800, by most reliable figures, China had the largest economy in the world. These are re-emerging powers in a very significant sense. And they have a lot of alternative social and cultural norms, historical understandings about appropriate social life, gender, sexuality, things of this sort. This is not terra nullius for the human rights idea or for the Western idea. This will be a significant period of contestation. So I argue we live in a period of significant change. One of the things that will feature in this change is the question of the ontology that underlies human rights. I think we take it for granted. We've talked a lot about the idea of the human, and I'm sure we all have a similar sense of what constitutes the human in this respect. But it's not clear that that's shared within all other societies. Why should one's identity be derived from within a kind of strict sense of individualized bodily integrity? In many societies, people consider themselves to be constitutively members of families, members of kinship groups, members of extended communities. So the first thing will be how those sorts of norms, when they challenge the individualized human rights ontology fare, when they are within societies which are much more powerful than the societies that this Western idea has hitherto confronted. When we talk about words like respect, dignity, equality, there's nothing self-evident about these terms, it seems to me. The next question is, what do you mean by respect? What do you mean by dignity? What do you mean by equality? And to these you will get a significant number of culturally specific answers. It's been interesting to see that the language of dignity has been disinterred in the last few years. I would argue this comes because of this crisis of confidence about what underlies the human rights idea, which can often seem to be a lot about law and a lot of about institutions in Geneva and New York. Dignity, it was hoped, I think, would give a more, would replace those physical foundations that Anthony was referring to. But dignity is a deeply problematic concept. Within the Human Rights Council, Russia's used the idea of dignity under a traditional values rubric to try to argue that human rights are taken care of in traditional societies. The Catholic Church has taught the language of dignity for centuries and is very happy talking it now. So it's no answer. What this requires us to do is locate human rights language politically. So Stephen's intervention, which is we shouldn't get hung up on language, Language has a political life of its own. If you study the human rights movement, you'll discover that so much of its inner workings is about who can speak legitimately in the name of human rights. That's a contest over language. Who speaks the rights language? And this transfers itself into funding, it transfers itself into international priorities. As any of you who study the international human rights movement in a contemporary idiom will know, there's the equivalent of a decolonization struggle within the international human rights movement. Between southern NGOs and social justice organizations, social movement organizations, who don't want to talk about what they see as quite a hegemonic understanding of what constitutes human rights, who want to talk about social justice, the right to food, the right to shelter, the right to medicine, and often find themselves constrained by this global structure, which says, okay, you've got a demand for some kind of social justice, let us help you put this through a human rights frame and represent it in Geneva. So who can speak authoritatively in terms of language? Who owns that language, I think, is an important question. This raises another issue for me, which is perhaps more of a more controversial issue, which is, for me, these languages are embedded in particular social classes. Who articulates these languages and what interests and needs do these languages meet? The contemporary human rights language at the global level is akin for me to an ideology of a particular kind of cosmopolitan transnational social class. This is how we explain the exclusion of many social and economic rights, second-generation rights, from consideration at the global level. It must be understood in relation to what function those rights have for this expanding global middle class, of whom there are members now in Indonesia, in India, in China, and elsewhere. Will those new members of this global middle class be progressive? Will they call for an international human rights movement? Will they join that movement? That's an important question, but it doesn't necessarily mean that in terms of social and economic rights or social justice, that new movement, that new class will be progressive in any meaningful sense. It may well not. It may be more concerned about freedom of expression, freedom of property rights, security rights, which were mentioned earlier, and less about redistributive rights. This new world is one, and humanitarians is in the title of our panel. This new world is one in which humanitarian organisations have to function in a different way. And I'll just state this boldly because we don't have time for anything else, and I'll say more in Q&A. Humanitarians, by and large, are backing away from the human rights language relatively quickly. Even Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, is de-emphasising the witnessing language in some contexts, Sri Lanka, Burma, Yemen, and elsewhere. What humanitarians understand is that in this contemporary world, in order to negotiate access, in order to deliver services, you will not be able to speak the unvarnished language of human rights anymore. Therefore, they often drop the language of protection, they begin to employ more local staff, invest seriously in trying to understand. There's a nice MSF report called In the Eyes of Others, where MSF has done a massive global study trying to find out what local people actually think of a large Western NGO in order to better adapt themselves to local circumstances. Can human rights organisations make the same shift? Can human rights advocates make the same shift? I'm sceptical about that because they tend to be lawyers rather than doctors, but that's something we can talk about in Q&A. A couple of final points, as I'm sure I've had my time. This doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing. It's clear that the language of human rights has been coded in a very particular way. And so I find it implausible that whatever more progressive language may evolve in a world where a new consensus has to be negotiated will be the language of human rights, which India, Russia, China in particular have always found problematic and are very reluctant to speak. This doesn't mean that there cannot be a new negotiated language. This does not mean that there cannot be a progressive language, which would be, it might be more about aspirations to equality. I have no special expertise here, but the language of human rights is deeply contaminated for many of those post-colonial societies. And given the role that China is likely to play in this world, and given China's implacable opposition to talking the language of human rights in a meaningful way, I suggest not that the diffusion of human rights via a Chinese middle class will lead to that language being increasingly globalized, but that there'll need to be an alternative language or an alternative idiom spoken, which may be the language of healthcare. There may be globalizing norms about healthcare. There may be globalizing norms about women's access to employment, labor rights, things of this sort. It will not be that globalized human rights language, which, as I say, doesn't necessarily mean that it will be a non-progressive future, and many, many new forms of social movement and activism may emerge in this space, but I'm deeply pessimistic about the human rights language as such going forward. Thank you.
So I want to thank our panelists both for their succinctness, but also for me, problematizing one term that has floated through the room most of the day, which is the very notion of the West. And so I think this is a wonderful opening up of the discussion that we began this morning.